environment, as well as the workforce, particularly the importance of sound legal and regulatory framework. We now go to the next presentation. And the next presentation is going to be done by Anne-Marie Lalonde. And Anne-Marie is a legal counsel with experience of more than 30 years for the Department of Justice of Canada, both as a legislative drafter and as a practitioner in the area of animal health and welfare. As a government lawyer, she worked for the Canadian Food Inspection Agency for close to 10 years, and as such has gained practical experience with animal health and welfare issues. She is accredited by the OA to conduct missions in the context of veterinary legislative support program, and has done so in various African countries. Welcome, Anne-Marie.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon. And welcome to everyone who's on the call to this, and thank you for participating in this webinar. So I was asked to talk, I will share my screen right now. Let me know if this works. There we go. Is this okay? Is my screen shared?
Yeah, partly shared. It's having half of it.
Okay, just a sec. Oh, well, you need this. Is that okay?
Just came in and got lost again. I don't know whether it's from on my side or everybody can see the share.
Maybe click the slideshow mode. That might help.
Yes.
There you are. Yeah.
Thank you. Nice trick. So I was asked to talk about veterinary legislation today, and more specifically about legislation that governs the veterinary profession, and to talk about how this legislation can be improved and how it is important to include the VPPs. So I will start by with some basic notions that are relevant to veterinary legislation. We will talk. I will also talk about set out certain rules of thumb for drafting good quality legislation, as well as the benefits of having good quality legislation in everyone's country. And then we will focus on this legislation governing the veterinary practice by setting out the purposes of that legislation, the importance of that legislation, and the elements that WOHA would like to see in this legislation. And finally, I will say a few words about how to modernize veterinary practice legislation to include VPPs. So as a start, what does the word legislation refer to? I just want to make a little reminder here that the word legislation is a generic term that collectively refers to all rules that are in force in a country. So that would include the constitution of the country, any statutes or laws, regulations, bylaws, rules, orders, anything that is, any legislative text is part of the legislation, what we call legislation. So the one characteristic that is important is that legislation is of general application, which means that it applies to an undeterminate number of persons, as opposed to individual decisions made by the government. Mandatory compliance is the second characteristic to legislation. It is mandatory for everyone who is targeted by the legislation. Is mandatory for them to comply with the legislation. And that's what we call also having the force of law, which means that failure to comply with the legislation has legal consequences, or it should have legal consequences. What we call the veterinary legislation is the legislation that governs all areas of the veterinary domain in a country. So basically, it's usually we talk about 2 or 3 pieces of legislation, namely the law or statute that creates the veterinary statutory body. Sometimes there is, in addition to that law, there is a statute that deals with the veterinary profession itself. There might be also some orders or regulations or rules that govern the activities of either VPPs or community animal health workers. But basically that's, in most instances, that's what we are talking about, these 3 or 4 or 2 instruments. But it does, it has to cover the entire veterinary domain to be part of the veterinary legislation. And the veterinary domain, as you all know, probably, is that it refers to all activities that are directly or indirectly related to animals, their products or byproducts, which help to protect and maintain and improve animal health, animal welfare, and veterinary public health. That comes from directly from the Terrestrial Animal Health Code. So that's what we call the veterinary domain. So the veterinary legislation sets out the rules of conduct for all persons engaged in activities within that veterinary domain by imposing either duties or obligations on them, and by imposing prohibitions on them. Also, the veterinary legislation provides, it's a second aspect of the veterinary legislation, which is important, is that it provides legal basis for the powers and functions to be exercised by the competent authority for the regulation of the veterinary domain. So if we look at, for instance, in the criminal domain, the principle is that in your day-to-day life, you can do pretty much everything you wish to do. If it's not prohibited by the criminal code, it's okay. So that's in the criminal domain. But when it comes to the legislation dealing with the activity of government, it's the opposite. The competent authority cannot exercise any power unless the legislation has provided a legal basis for that power. So it's important that the veterinary legislation, in that context, it's important that they set out in detail every power and duties and functions that the competent authority has to regulate the veterinary domain. David just talked about that a few minutes ago, but as you know, when countries become member of WOHA, they agree to meet the standards that are set up in these 2 codes, or at least they agree to work towards achieving these standards. Terrestrial and Animal Health Code, that's where the WOHA standards are, and their purpose, in essence, is twofold. It's aimed at improving the health and welfare of animals throughout the world, and it's also to establish high-quality national veterinary services. And one condition for high-quality veterinary services is high-quality legislation to support their action. David talked already about Chapter 4 of the Terrestrial Animal Health Code. This is the part of the code where WOHA has established standards that relate specifically to the veterinary legislation in a country. I won't go through the entire list, but just for the purposes of the webinar, it's important that you know that this chapter sets out the general principles of about veterinary legislation, and it sets out rules for drafting good legislation. And then it breaks into different parts to deal with all elements that should be dealt with by the veterinary legislation. And one of them is the veterinarians and veterinary professionals, and that's Article 3.4.6. So when for lawmakers, in order to ensure that all the elements listed in the code are covered by the legislation, you should at the very least go to Article 3.4.6. That's where the main elements are listed. If we turn to the rules of thumb for drafting good legislation, the very, very first principle we need to mention is to establish the policy in great detail from the start. You don't develop policy as you develop legislation. It's very important that the policy be totally prior to ending in drafting. And that's the principle that's comes, the principle is translated by the saying that says good policy makes good legislation. So to the opposite, if your policy is not clear and you don't, lawmakers do not know exactly where they're going or which state they want to remedy, the that comes out of office. The important rule to follow should use plain language that is to the end user. We're dealing with the oil operations or oil rigs. This sector is made of persons who are highly trained and have all the technical understanding of the field, but so it's okay in that context to use language that is more technical or complex. But in the area of animal health, it is important to use plain language that is comprehensible to end users. Another rule is to use clear, precise, and unambiguous terminology. So lawmakers should be careful in every sentence that they draft, that every word is sufficiently clear that the person, just from reading the text, should understand how to govern themselves. They should not question. There shouldn't be any question marks. There shouldn't be any confusion about what a specific word means. The other rule is to use consistent terminology within the same text and from one text to another. I've been on a few VLSP missions so far, and I would say that this is one rule that is often overlooked. In the same text, very often you will see terminology that is inconsistent. For instance, the text starts with the expression veterinary doctor, and 5 or 6 provisions later, or articles later, turns to professional veterinary, or veterinary professional, or veterinary surgeon. And for a reader, it's very unclear to, it's very confusing to have different language. And we see that within the same text, and we see that also from one text to another. So it's important for lawmakers to stick to, when they decide on a certain terminology, how to designate veterinary doctors or how to designate VPPs or other auxiliaries. It's important that this terminology is used throughout. And if other text needs to be revised to make this terminology consistent, it should be done so it's crystal clear to everyone what all of these words mean. Another rule is that to ensure that all definitions are necessary and relevant to the national context. Again, this is something that needs, usually in my experience, this is something that needs to be worked on in many statutes, where the list of definitions is extremely long. And when you look at all of these definitions, some of them are not necessary because either the word being defined is not used in the text, or it's not necessary because it carries an obvious meaning, which doesn't need to be defined per se. Or else the definitions, we see that often the definitions are pasted from the glossary of the animal health, the terrestrial animal health code. That happens often, probably because lawmakers have been told that the definitions should be the same, and to a certain extent, yes, definitions should be the same. But I think the essence, the message is that the words that are used in a country should reflect what the WOHA expects from the countries, not necessarily that the definitions be word to word. So you need to make sure that the definitions are adapted and relevant to the national context. And in the case of regional legislation or legislation that is developed with the assistance of an international or regional organization, it's important that when you adapt or where you import this uniform legislation, it's important that it's made relevant and adapted to the national context. Otherwise, these definitions they make no sense because the definitions need to relate to the text itself. Another rule is to use that's a rule that you would follow in drafting any kind of text, but in the context of legislation, it's important that lawmakers use a logical and coherent structure, namely by grouping together all the provisions that deal with the same subject matter and having headings and to clearly divide the text so that it's easy to read for everyone. It's difficult for readers or for even public officers who are responsible for applying the law. It's difficult when they have to go from one place to the other to understand what the law is. So important to keep a coherent structure and a logical way of setting on the provisions. And as well, when lawmakers prescribe a procedure, it's important to describe the various steps in their natural successive order, which is normally in the procedure, it should be the chronological order. So if the lawmakers impose a duty on, for instance, on readers to have a permit to engage into a certain kind of activity, then the first way to start is to set out how to apply for that permit and what are the conditions to have this certificate. And then there should be a provision setting out the power of the minister or whoever to issue the certificate, the permit. And then later on, in the same logic, what happens, what are the grounds for suspension of that permit or the grounds for revocation of that permit? So it should follow that logical and chronological order. One other rule important to follow is to make sure when you draft your legislation that there are no contradictory or overlapping provisions, which often occur. Sometimes the rules are repeated more than once, so it's not necessary to duplicate rules, but it's also there's also a risk that they overlap and sometimes that they are not exactly drafted the same way. So that creates a contradiction, or that creates at the very least a confusion. So you need to make sure when you draft legislation to look at every provision and ensure there's any contradiction. And the one that I just overlook is just the second to previous one, is that the rules only need to be stated once. I just already said that, but I want to insist on that. If for instance, you want to set out the requirements to become a VPP, the educational requirements to become a VPP, you only need to say it in the legislation or whichever legislative text you choose to put this in. It does not need to be repeated in other legislative texts. So try to avoid any duplications or redundancy, first within the same text or from one text to another. We often see that having the same set of requirements or sometimes slightly different sets of requirements for one activity from one text to another. So it's got to be at one place only. So The next important principle is that good legislation clearly sets out the rights, duties, and obligations of each person, and the acts and forms of conduct that are prohibited, as well as the consequences for failure to comply with these either obligations or prohibitions. It's important that the consequences are there, because otherwise there is no teeth to the legislation if there is only an obligation and no consequences. So in essence, the lawmakers should ensure, if you read all of this together, it basically comes down to ensuring that all provisions of the text form a coherent whole, and that all provisions can be read together without causing confusion or ambiguity. And the idea is it's like a puzzle. You need, every piece is important, every piece needs to fit together, and there are not two pieces of the same kind, and there cannot be a missing piece either. You have to make sure that everything is in there, because before you can end your work and hope that is good legislation.
Are you winding up, Maïla? Your time is,
No.
I think.
Oh, us already? Okay.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. I will let you read that key message later, but in essence, if you think of the number of persons who will read the regulation, the legislation, and the number of situations that the legislation is meant to cover, the key message is to be very clear. So I'll let you read that sentence when you have time. The benefits of good quality legislation are obvious. But it shows in practice, it's where you realize how important good quality legislation is. So basically, no confusion, no room for interpretation. The end users understand how to govern themselves. And to the opposite, public officers have also a good grasp of what the law says, and their compliance verification activities are made easier, as well as their enforcement activities. So there's a common understanding for public officers and for end users, to a common understanding of how the law should be applied. It's important within veterinary services, for instance, if you have many public officers in the field verifying compliance, it's important that all of them have the same understanding of what the law says, and that ensures equal treatment and consistent treatment for everyone. And by doing so, the credibility of the veterinary services is enhanced, as well, of course, ultimately, the animal health and welfare. So veterinary practice legislation is the legislation that governs the veterinary practice. It should set out, WOHI requires that it sets out a number of basic elements that are listed here, and David already talked about a few of them. So the competent authority should be specified, which is a responsibility who's responsible for the registration and regulation of veterinary professionals and VPPs. The law should include their mandates, their role, their duties. The law should include also the educational requirements for veterinarians and VPPs, as well as other qualifications, as David already talked about. So nationality, age, the payment of fees, and so on. Important point is that the veterinary body should have the authority to develop a rule of conduct and to enforce that code. So not only develop the code, but also adopt the code. It should have legal force. Other important elements that you should see in veterinary profession legislation is, especially in the context of including VPPs, are the list of prerogatives and roles and responsibilities of veterinarians. They should be made very clear so that there's no overlap and there's no doubt in terms of who can do what between veterinarians and VPPs. The law should also include specify the classes of VPPs that are recognized by the country, normally according to their level of education, and the range of activities that VPPs can perform and the conditions governing the performance of these activities. And that's a clearly important element to have in the legislation. That's where confusion can occur and can create difficulties politically and technically if the roles of each category of veterinary service providers is not clearly, the line is not clearly set in the legislation. And another important element is the supervision of VPPs by veterinarians. That's a key point here. And especially depending on what type of category is recognized in the country, the level of supervision may vary, but it needs to be set out in the legislation. And finally, one of the essential elements is the exceptional situations where VPPs may perform acts that normally would be in the prerogative of veterinarians. And at the end, adherence to the code of conduct. We already talked about the authority of the veterinary statutory body, to develop a code, but the corollary is that members of the profession should have an obligation to comply with that code of conduct. And then therefore there should be a complaint mechanism and procedure in the legislation, as well as the disciplinary process and sanctions and offense provisions and penalties for non-members. The modernizing the veterinary practice legislation is something that is an activity that many countries will have to engage on. And based on what we just discussed, the very first requirement is that the policy that needs to be transposed in the legislation must be clearly set out from the beginning. There should not be any discussion when legislative drafting starts. At that point in time, the discussion about the policy and the direction of the strategy, these discussions should be over by then. So then you just focus on the language and the structure of the legislative text. So once you have done that policy, you need to make an inventory of all existing texts that are currently in force in the country. And in every one of these texts to identify every provision that needs to be amended to include VPPs, add any element that is missing for the proper regulation of VPPs as well. And of course, you take this opportunity to ensure that all elements are also in the legislation for the proper regulations of veterinarians. That's a good exercise to carry, as well as to improve the quality of the legislation if needed. Repeal any text. If you see that any legislative text, rules, orders, or whatever are still in the books but are no longer needed or no longer in use, you should repeal that text so it is removed from the books and it does not create confusion with new text that you will adopt. And finally, if changes are made to a statute but subject matters are left to the regulation, you will insist on the importance of ensuring that the regulations are drafted in parallel with the legislation to make sure that when the legislation is adopted, that it can be applied, it can be implemented because the regulatory texts are already in place. Finally, if there's legal counsel in the department where the lawmakers work, legal counsel can certainly provide a good guidance and support in this endeavor. So thank you. That was very